There's a moment when everything shifts. Not because you exposed yourself, but because they finally saw what was always there. And that realization doesn't feel like victory to them. It feels like they're catching up to something they should have noticed all along. They start replaying interactions like investigators reviewing footage, your calm demeanor, your measured words, that steady presence that never wavered even under pressure, and suddenly a phrase crystallizes in their mind. Strategic composure. The misunderstanding of power. Here's what challenges their assumptions. You were never trying to win in the traditional sense. You simply listened. You observed. You allowed space for others to reveal themselves because people show their true nature when they feel secure and unmonitored. Many people confuse noise with strength. They believe being loud equals being dominant, that aggression equals control. But genuine influence operates differently. It's often invisible. It's knowing when not to react. It's maintaining perspective while others lose theirs. It's observing someone project confidence while revealing their underlying fears. You weren't simply being polite, you were gathering information. You weren't just being patient, you were allowing patterns to emerge. You weren't only being kind, you were letting others underestimate what comes next. The weight of late awareness. Consider how disorienting that realization must be, discovering that every moment they felt ahead was actually permitted, that every instance of feeling powerful was an opportunity for you to understand them better, that every time they dismissed your composure, they were missing the larger picture. You didn't rush because haste creates errors. You didn't over-explain because explanations can weaken your position. You didn't become defensive because defense suggests uncertainty. You moved like someone who had already considered multiple outcomes. And here's the part that can't be undone. By the time someone recognizes strategic restraint, the dynamic has already shifted. There's no reset button, no sudden upgrade in understanding. Just awareness arriving after the fact. The strategy of underestimation. They assumed you were harmless. That assumption created a blind spot. That blind spot became a disadvantage. Because the most effective people don't announce their capabilities. They let others feel comfortable enough to make miscalculations. You allowed them to believe you were passive. You let them think you were slow to act. You permitted the assumption that you were behind. Meanwhile, you were positioning yourself thoughtfully, emotionally centered, mentally prepared for various scenarios. Now they're analyzing, labeling, calling it manipulation or calculation. But that's not criticism. That's the sound of someone realizing they misjudged the situation. The distinction of restraint. Remember this, anyone can dominate through force. Few can dominate through restraint. Anyone can be loud. Almost no one can maintain composure under pressure. And the person who responds last often shapes the outcome. So let them figure it out. Let the understanding arrive late. Let the recognition settle in. You were never hiding who you are. They simply weren't prepared to see it clearly. The aftermath. They'll pretend it doesn't affect them. They'll maintain appearances, joke, say, it's not that serious. But in quiet moments, when distractions fade, that's when it returns. Because once someone realizes they were being quietly outmaneuvered, it affects their self-perception. Obvious defeats wound the ego. Silent ones undermine self-trust. They begin questioning their instincts, their assessments, their confidence. They review moments where they felt powerful, and those same moments now seem orchestrated as if they were participants in a scenario they didn't write. The freedom of independence. Here's what challenges them most. You never needed their approval. You never required validation. You never needed to be understood. That independence alone created a fundamental difference. Most people are governed by reactions, by the need for validation, by wanting to be seen as right or dominant. You stepped outside that framework. You didn't react to insults. You didn't chase attention when ignored. You didn't panic when tested. You allowed people to show their authentic selves when they thought the spotlight was theirs. That's why your silence carried weight. That's why your presence affected the atmosphere without effort, because composure is unsettling to people who operate through chaos. The nature of discipline. They mistook your restraint for limitation. What it actually represented was discipline, and discipline always outlasts impulse. You understood something early that most learn late. Emotional control isn't weakness, it's leverage. Every time they lost composure, you gained information. Every time they over-explained, you gained clarity. Every time they tried to provoke you and couldn't, you gained positioning. They were playing checkers with emotions. You were playing chess with time, and time favors patience. That's why when they finally understood, their awareness felt incomplete. Because understanding didn't grant them power, it revealed how much ground they'd already lost. They realized they were predictable, readable, transparent. Meanwhile, you remained a question they couldn't answer. The power of questions. You didn't need to dominate conversations. You didn't need to prove intelligence. You didn't need to assert control. You allowed them to assume it was theirs. Assumption is dangerous. It makes people careless. It makes them reveal patterns. It makes them mistake comfort for security. You watch this unfold in real time, when the shift finally occurred, when their tone changed, when they paused longer, when their confidence suddenly needed reinforcement. That's when you knew the realization had begun. Not explosive or dramatic, just a gradual sinking awareness, the kind that doesn't leave visible marks but changes behavior permanently. From that point forward, nothing felt the same for them. They became cautious around you, measured, careful, because they could no longer identify the boundaries. And that's influence. Real influence. Genuine power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't rush. It waits. So don't explain yourself now. Don't soften the reality. Don't apologize for maintaining composure in a world that rewards reaction. Let them sit with the discomfort of finally understanding and recognizing that understanding arrived too late. You didn't manipulate. You didn't deceive. You simply maintained boundaries around your inner world. And to undisciplined minds, that feels like opposition. Stay composed. Stay difficult to read. Stay patient. Because those who understand you last never had the advantage they thought they did. The behavioral shift. They'll never say it directly, but their behavior will reveal everything. Watch how they choose words more carefully around you. Watch how humor softens, how arrogance diminishes, how confidence suddenly needs witnesses. That's not growth, that's caution. You've moved from being underestimated to being a source of discomfort. And uncomfortable people don't rest easy. Because once someone senses they're not in control, their mind starts creating narratives. They imagine angles you never revealed, motives you never confirmed, depths you never showed. You became an unsolved question, and humans dislike uncertainty more than loss. The testing phase. They'll test you again, more subtly this time. They'll attempt to provoke reactions to see if the previous version of you still exists. They'll make subtle jabs disguised as humor. They'll search for emotional leaks. And when nothing emerges, that's when respect transforms into wariness. Not fear of violence, but fear of influence. Because influence means you don't need permission to affect outcomes. You don't need volume. You don't need numbers. You don't even need confrontation. Your presence alone shifts behavior. The observation. You'll notice it. People speaking less when you arrive, listening more, watching you when decisions are made. Not because you demanded authority, but because you never begged for relevance. You didn't chase power. You allowed it to develop naturally. The uncomfortable truth. Here's what most people struggle to accept. Those complaining about manipulation are often frustrated they didn't notice sooner. They mistake self-control for deception. They call strategy coldness. They label discipline calculation because admitting they were outmatched hurts more than any direct insult. You force them to confront a difficult reality, that they aren't as perceptive as they believed, that their instincts failed them, that their confidence wasn't earned, it was assumed, and assumptions crumble under silence. The mirror effect. Silence is a mirror. It reflects people back to themselves, and not everyone appreciates what they see. That's why they projected. That's why they spoke behind your back. That's why they tried to define you instead of understand you. Because understanding requires humility, and humility is rare. You never needed to expose them. They did that themselves. You simply provided space. Space to speak, to posture, to reveal patterns they didn't realize they were repeating. And you remembered everything, not emotionally, but strategically. You didn't store grudges, you stored information. That's the difference. Grudges drain energy. Information creates options, and options are freedom. The moment of choice. When the moment arrived, not dramatic, not cinematic, just inevitable, you were prepared, not to attack or retaliate, but to choose. Choose distance, choose silence, choose leverage, choose when to disengage and when to stay. That choice alone shifted the balance, because people fear what they can't predict, and they can no longer predict you. You're not reactive, you're not impulsive, you're not emotionally accessible to chaos, and that makes you formidable in a world addicted to noise. The label. Let them label it however they want. Let them comfort themselves with explanations. The truth is simpler and harder to accept. You mastered yourself, and anyone who does that naturally transcends their environment. So continue moving as you do, measured, unhurried, deliberate. Once someone realizes they lost control quietly, they don't just become wary of you, they start distrusting themselves. The cascade of doubt. Every decision after that feels uncertain. Every instinct feels questionable. Every assessment needs reconsideration because you broke something deeper than ego. You broke certainty. They start wondering about other moments in their life. How many other people smiled while studying them? How many situations they thought they controlled but didn't? That kind of doubt spreads. It affects how they speak, how they lead, how they assert themselves. Confidence built on noise collapses quickly when silence exposes it, and you never needed to confront them directly. You simply stood there, composed, grounded, unmoved, like a mirror they couldn't ignore. Here's the realization. That's when they understood something unsettling. You're not formidable because you're aggressive. You're formidable because you're independent of outcomes. You don't need to win loudly. You don't need to humiliate. You don't need to prove superiority. You can walk away intact. And nothing unsettles insecure people more than someone who can leave without resentment. The revision. They'll try to rewrite history. Say you were lucky. Say it was timing. Say you're reading too much into it. These are coping mechanisms, because admitting they were strategically outpaced would require accountability, and accountability is heavy. The different operating system. You move differently because you think differently. You don't chase reactions. You don't argue with emotions. You don't wrestle with chaos. You let chaos exhaust itself. That patience isn't passive, it's calculated calm. It's understanding that emotional people burn themselves out while disciplined minds compound quietly. They swung. You waited. They rushed. You observed. They reacted. You recorded. And when the moment came, subtle and almost invisible, the power shifted, not with confrontation or speeches, but with absence. Your emotional absence removed their leverage, no buttons to press, no nerves to hit, no ego to provoke, just a calm boundary they couldn't penetrate. The spiral. That's when people who need control begin to spiral. They start oversharing, over-explaining, overreaching. They expose motives they didn't intend to reveal. And you see it all clearly now, not with anger, but with clarity. The alignment. You realize you were never meant to stay small in environments that reward noise over depth. You were never meant to compete with people who need validation to function. You were meant to outgrow them. That's why this doesn't feel like revenge. It feels like alignment, like gravity finally pulling things into proper order. You didn't change who you are. You just stopped dispersing energy unnecessarily. And that's when everything sharpened. Tatar. The shift in presence. Your words carry weight now. Your silence carries more. Your presence shifts dynamics without effort, because people sense when someone has internal order. They feel it, they adjust to it, they respect it even without understanding it, and understanding isn't required for impact. The discomfort. If they're uncomfortable now, let them be. Growth isn't supposed to feel comfortable to those who relied on your confusion. Let them call it psychological strategy. History always labels discipline as harsh when it disrupts comfort. You know the truth. You didn't attack. You didn't manipulate. You didn't deceive. You simply stopped being accessible to disorder. And in a world built on reaction, that alone feels threatening. The earnings stay steady because the calmest person in the room is never there by accident. They earned it through experience and discipline. The point of no return. Understand this. Once you cross that internal threshold, there's no returning to who you were. You can't unsee patterns. You can't unknow dynamics. You can't pretend ignorance after clarity arrives. That's why this phase can feel isolating. Not because you're alone, but because you're no longer available for superficial interactions. People who thrived on your reactions feel deprived now. People who had easy access feel excluded. People who mistook your openness for entitlement feel offended. Let them. Growth always looks like arrogance to those who benefited from your previous state. The clarity. You're not colder, you're clearer. And clarity can be ruthless. You've learned when to speak and when silence accomplishes more. You've learned that explanations diminish authority. You've learned that not everyone deserves access to your thoughts, your energy, your internal state. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you selective, and selection is essential. The true leverage. The world trains people to externalize power, louder voices, stronger opinions, constant motion. But real leverage is internal. It's the ability to remain unchanged while others destabilize themselves trying to understand you. That's mastery. You've stopped reacting to provocations, stopped engaging in emotional negotiations, stopped volunteering yourself for misinterpretation. Now you move with intent. And intent changes everything. The new dynamic conversations feel different because you don't overgive. Conflicts dissolve because you don't escalate. Tension shifts because you don't mirror chaos. You've become asymmetrical. And asymmetry unsettles people who rely on predictability. They don't know how to handle someone who won't take the bait, who won't chase closure, who won't fight for validation. So they call it cold, they call it detached, they call it strategic. Restraint, the names we give, those are just names people assign to discipline they don't possess. You didn't harden your heart, you sharpened your boundaries. You didn't disconnect from people, you disconnected from nonsense. And now every interaction has significance. Because when you finally speak, it's deliberate. When you finally act, it's decisive. When you finally leave, it's permanent. No theatrics, no announcements, no emotional debris. Just clean exits and quiet progress. Where power lives. This is where power exists. Not in domination, but in self-command. Not in intimidation, but in restraint. Not in chaos, but in control. And the irony, the same people who once dismissed you now study you. The same ones who overlooked you now monitor your actions. The same ones who felt superior now feel exposed. That's the cost of awareness arriving late. The truth. You didn't become formidable overnight. You were always capable. You just stopped leaking energy to environments that couldn't contain it. So maintain your pace. Keep your silence intentional. Keep your standards invisible but immovable. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. Let them try to reverse engineer what they failed to notice in real time. The conclusion. By the time people start calling it psychological strategy, it's already history. You're not fighting anymore. You're choosing. And choice, calm, detached, uncompromised choice, is the highest form of power there is. The most profound strength isn't found in force, but in the quiet mastery of self.